Welcome back to The Historian's Tome. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. Before we begin our journey into the ancient world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these stories from history.
I'm curious, where are you watching from right now?
What time is it there? Are you settling in for the evening? Or perhaps listening during a quiet morning? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, get comfortable. Tonight we travel back over 4,000 years to discover a civilization that has been almost completely forgotten. The Elamites, Persia's first kings. Let's begin. The story of the Elamites begins in a place that most people have never heard of. It starts in the highlands and valleys of what is now southwestern Iran. This was a land caught between two worlds. To the west lay Mesopotamia with its famous cities and powerful kingdoms. To the east stretched the vast Iranian plateau, mysterious and largely unknown to ancient writers. The Elamites called their land Haltamti. The name means land of the god. It was a good name for this place. The territory was blessed in many ways.
Mountains rose up in the north and east, their peaks touching the clouds.
These mountains caught the winter rains and stored water in the form of snow. When spring came, the snow melted and fed countless streams that ran down into the valleys below. The heart of Elam was the plain of Khuzestan. This flat, fertile land sits at the head of the Persian Gulf. Rivers crossed it, bringing water and rich soil from the mountains. The climate was hot but not too dry. Farmers could grow barley, wheat, and dates. They raised sheep and goats on the hillsides. The land provided everything needed for civilization to grow. But location matters in history. Elam sat right on the border between the Mesopotamian world and the Iranian world. This meant the Elamites were always dealing with powerful neighbors. The Sumerians lived to their west. Later came the Akkadians, then the Babylonians. These peoples were aggressive and always looking to expand their territory. The Elamites had to be strong to survive. The earliest traces of Elamite civilization go back to around 3200 BCE. This makes them as old as the earliest Sumerian cities. Archaeological sites like Susa show us that people were living in organized communities by this time. They were building with mud brick. They were making pottery. They were starting to develop writing. Susa would become the greatest city of Elam. It sat on a mound that rose above the plain, a natural fortress. The location was perfect for trade. Caravans traveling between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau had to pass through or near Susa. This brought wealth and new ideas to the city. It also brought danger because everyone wanted to control such an important crossroads. The early Elamites were not unified under one king. Instead, the land was divided into several regions. Each region had its own ruler and its own main city. Susa was the most important, but there were others.
Anshan sat high in the mountains to the east.
Awan was another important center, though we are not sure exactly where it was located. These separate kingdoms sometimes cooperated and sometimes fought each other. When a strong leader arose, he might unite several regions under his rule. When he died, the unity often fell apart again. This pattern would repeat throughout Elamite history. Unity and division strengthen weakness like the turning of a great wheel. The Elamites developed their own culture, distinct from their neighbors. They spoke their own language, unrelated to Sumerian or any of the Semitic languages spoken in Mesopotamia. Elamite was a language isolate, meaning it had no known relatives. When it died out, it left no descendants. The language used a writing system borrowed from Mesopotamia, but the words were entirely their own. Religion was central to Elamite life. They worshipped many gods and goddesses. The chief deity was Humban, sometimes called Humbam. He was a sky god, powerful and distant. Kiririsha was the great goddess associated with motherhood and the earth. Inshushinak was the god of Susa itself, the city's divine protector. Temples to these gods dominated the city's skylines. The Elamites believed their kings were chosen by the gods. When a new king took the throne, he went to the temple to be blessed by the priests. This ceremony was essential. Without it, the king's authority was questionable. The temple and the palace worked together to rule the land. Priests had enormous influence over political decisions. Family structure among the Elamites was different from most ancient societies. They practiced something that puzzled their neighbors. Brothers and sisters from the royal family often married each other. This was done to keep power within the family and to prevent disputes over succession. It seemed strange to outsiders, but to the Elamites, it made perfect sense. Women held surprisingly high status in Elamite society. Queens were not just wives of kings. They had their own authority and their own property. Some queens ruled alongside their husbands as equals. Others served as regents when kings died young, ruling until a prince came of age. This respect for women's power was unusual in the ancient world. The relationship between Elam and Mesopotamia was complicated from the very beginning. These two civilizations were neighbors, but they were also rivals. They traded with each other, learning from each other, borrowing ideas and technologies. But they also fought bitter wars that lasted for centuries. The first recorded conflicts came during the age of Sumer. The Sumerian kings saw Elam as a source of valuable resources. The Elamite highlands had timber, stone, and metals that were scarce in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Sumerian kings sent expeditions to take these resources by force. The Elamites resisted, and blood was spilled on both sides. Around 2700 BCE, a Sumerian king named Enmebaragesi claimed to have conquered Elam. We cannot be sure if this claim was true. Ancient kings often exaggerated their victories, but it shows that even at this early date, the two regions were in conflict. Sumer wanted to dominate its eastern neighbor, and Elam refused to submit. Then came Sargon of Akkad. He was one of history's great conquerors, the man who created the world's first empire. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon united the cities of Mesopotamia under his rule. But he did not stop there. He turned his armies east toward Elam. The Akkadian war machine was powerful and disciplined. It crushed the Elamite forces in battle after battle. Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin pushed even deeper into Elam. He captured the city of Susa and claimed to rule over all the Elamite lands. For a time, Elam disappeared as an independent power. The Elamite kings became vassals, forced to pay tribute to their Akkadian overlords. It was a dark period in Elamite history, a time of submission and humiliation, but empires do not last forever. The Akkadian Empire began to crumble about a century after Sargon's death. Internal rebellions weakened it. Invading tribes from the mountains attacked it. The whole structure came crashing down around 2150 BCE. When the dust settled, Elam was free again. The Elamites did not waste time celebrating their freedom. They immediately began rebuilding their strength. A line of kings from the city of Awan took control. These rulers called themselves the Awan dynasty. They worked to reunify the scattered Elamite territories. They rebuilt armies and fortifications. They prepared for the next round of conflict, because everyone knew it was coming. It came in the form of the third dynasty of Ur. This was a Sumerian kingdom that rose to power around 2100
BCE. The kings of Ur were determined to rebuild the glory of
Sumer. They looked east toward Elam with hungry eyes. The wars began again, bloody and brutal as before. The Ur kings had some success at first. They captured outlying Elamite territories and forced some local rulers to submit. But they never managed to conquer Elam completely. The Elamites fought back fiercely, defending their homeland with everything they had. The mountains gave them natural fortresses where they could retreat when things went badly. Then the tables turned in a dramatic way. Around 2004 BCE, an Elamite king named Kindatu decided to strike back. He gathered a great army and marched west into Mesopotamia. His target was Ur itself, the enemy capital. The attack was swift and devastating. The Elamites stormed the city, tore down its walls, and carried off its treasures. But the greatest prize was human. Kindatu captured the king of a man named Ibi-Sin. Taking a king prisoner was the ultimate humiliation. Ibi-Sin was dragged back to Elam in chains, a trophy of war. The third dynasty of collapsed completely after this disaster.
It never recovered.
For the Elamites, it was a moment of triumph and revenge. With destroyed, Elam entered a new phase of power and confidence. The Elamite kings were no longer just defending their borders. Now they were the ones doing the attacking. They raided into Mesopotamia whenever they wanted. They took captives, looted cities, and demanded tribute from weaker neighbors. The balance of power had shifted. This period saw the rise of the Simashki dynasty, named after a region in the eastern highlands. These kings ruled a united Elam that stretched from the lowlands to the mountains. They built new palaces and temples. They expanded trade networks that reached as far as the Indus Valley in the east. Elamite merchants grew wealthy and the cities prospered, but success brought new challenges. The more powerful Elam became, the more enemies it made. Other kingdoms watched nervously as Elamite power grew. They began to form alliances against Elam to contain its expansion. The Elamites found themselves surrounded by suspicious neighbors, all waiting for a chance to bring them down. Around 1900 BCE, Elam entered what historians call the Sukalma period. This name comes from a title used by Elamite rulers, Sukalma, which means something like Grand Regent. It was a strange political system, unlike anything else in the ancient world. Understanding it helps us see just how different the Elamites were from their neighbors. Instead of having one king with absolute power, the Elamites divided authority among several people. At the top was the Sukalma, the senior ruler who lived in Susa. Below him was the Sukal, a junior king who often ruled from another city. And there was also the Sukal of Elam and Simashki, a third ruler with his own territory and responsibilities. This three-part system was based on family relationships. Typically, the Sukalma was the oldest brother. The Sukal was his younger brother. The third position might go to a son or nephew. When the Sukalma died, everyone moved up one step. The Sukal became the new Sukalma. The third ruler became the new Sukal. A new person from the family took the third position. Why did the Elamites use this complicated system? It was a way to avoid civil wars over succession. In most kingdoms, when a king died, his sons fought each other for the throne. Brothers killed brothers. The kingdom was torn apart. The Elamite system tried to prevent this by making the succession automatic and clear. Everyone knew who would rule next. The system also distributed power, which made revolts less likely. If you were unhappy with the Sukalma, you might still be loyal to one of the other rulers who was your local lord. If one city rebelled, the other cities remained loyal. It was a clever way to keep the kingdom stable and united. During this period, Susa reached new heights of wealth and culture. The city grew larger, with new neighborhoods spreading out from the old center. Skilled craftsmen produced beautiful works of art. Potters made vessels with intricate designs. Metalworkers created jewelry, weapons, and tools. Sculptors carved stone statues of gods and kings. The Elamites were also great builders. They constructed massive temples that dominated the city skyline. These buildings were made of mud brick, the main construction material in this part of the world. Stone was rare and expensive, so it was used only for important details. The temples were decorated with colored tiles and glazed bricks that sparkled in the sunlight. Religion remained central to everything. The temples were not just places of worship. They were economic centers that owned land, employed workers, and conducted trade. The priests who ran the temples were powerful figures who advised the rulers on important decisions. No king could rule effectively without the support of the priesthood. Trade flourished during the Sukalma period. Elamite merchants traveled far and wide buying and selling goods. From Mesopotamia came grain, textiles, and luxury items. From the Iranian plateau came metals, especially copper, and tin needed to make bronze. From the east came lapis lazuli, a beautiful blue stone highly prized for jewelry. The Elamites also served as middlemen, connecting different regions. Goods from the Indus Valley traveled through Elam on their way to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian products went east through Elamite territory. The rulers taxed this trade, which brought wealth into the royal treasury. Control of trade routes was a source of power and influence, but the Sukalma period was not a time of constant peace. Wars continued, though they were less frequent than before. The Elamites fought with the various kingdoms that arose in Mesopotamia. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. The important thing was that Elam remained independent and strong enough to defend itself. One of the most powerful rulers of this era was Shutruk-Nahhunte. She was not a king but a queen, the wife of a Sukalma. When her husband died, she did not step aside. Instead, she ruled in her own right, taking the title of ruling lady. For decades, she governed Elam with wisdom and strength. Her reign showed the unusual status of women in Elamite society. Shutruk-Nahhunte was succeeded by her daughter, who also ruled as queen. This was the Elamite way. Power could pass from mother to daughter just as easily as from father to son. Gender was less important than family lineage and personal ability. A capable woman was seen as just as fit to rule as any man. The Sukalma period lasted for about 300 years. From roughly 1900 to 1600 BCE, it was a time of relative stability and prosperity. The political system, strange as it seemed to outsiders, worked well. Elam was united, wealthy, and respected by its neighbors, but nothing lasts forever. Around 1600 BCE, something went wrong in Elam. We are not entirely sure what happened because the historical records become very scarce. It is like a curtain falls over Elamite history, hiding events from our view. Historians call this the Dark Age of Elam, a period of confusion and decline that lasted for several centuries. The archaeological evidence tells us that many cities were abandoned during this time. Susa seems to have lost much of its population. Other settlements were destroyed and never rebuilt. Something catastrophic happened, but we can only guess at the cause. One possibility is environmental disaster. Climate change might have brought drought to the region. If the rains failed for several years in a row, crops would have failed.
Famine would have spread across the land.
People would have left the cities to search for food elsewhere. The kingdom would have collapsed from within. Another possibility is foreign invasion. This was the time when new peoples were moving across the ancient world. The Kassites, a people from the mountains, conquered Babylon around 1595 BCE. Perhaps they also attacked Elam, or perhaps other groups from the Iranian plateau invaded from the east. An invasion could have shattered the unity of the kingdom. Internal conflict might also explain the darkness. Perhaps the Sukalma system finally broke down. Brothers might have fought for power instead of sharing it. Civil war could have torn the kingdom apart. Without unity, the cities would have become vulnerable to raids and economic collapse. Whatever the cause, Elam nearly disappeared during this dark age. For several centuries, there were no powerful kings issuing inscriptions. No great buildings were constructed. Trade declined. The cities shrank. It seemed possible that Elam might vanish entirely from history, absorbed by its neighbors, or simply forgotten. But something remarkable happened. Elam did not die. Somewhere in the ruins of the old kingdom, leaders arose who began the slow work of rebuilding. By 1400 BCE, we start to see signs of recovery. New inscriptions appear.
Kings claim authority again.
Susa begins to grow. Like a phoenix rising from ashes, Elam returned to life. The kingdom that emerged was somewhat different from what came before. The old Sukalma system was gone. Now there was a single king with absolute power. The political structure looked more like the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. Perhaps the Elamites had learned from their neighbors during the dark years. This new phase of Elamite history is called the Middle Elamite period. It ran from about 1400 to 1100 BCE. These centuries saw Elam rise once again to become a major power in the region. The kings of this era were warriors who expanded Elamite territory and fought great battles against powerful enemies. One of the first strong kings of this revival was Pahir-ish-Shan. He ruled around 1350 BCE and began the work of restoring Elamite power. He rebuilt the army and secured the borders. He restored the old trade routes that had been abandoned during the Dark Age. Under his leadership, merchants began traveling the roads again, and wealth flowed back into the kingdom. But the real architect of Elamite power was Shutruk-Nahhunte. He ruled around 1275 BCE and was one of the greatest kings in all of Elamite history. Shutruk-Nahhunte did not just restore what had been lost. He created something new and magnificent that would ensure his name lived forever. His greatest achievement was the construction of a new holy city called Dur-Untash, which means Fortress of Untash. Today this site is called Chogha-Zanbil, and its ruins still stand in the Iranian province of Khuzestan. It was a city built entirely for religious purposes, a gift to the gods. At the heart of Dur-Untash stood a ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid. This ziggurat was dedicated to Inshushinak, the god of Susa. It rose 5 stories high, each level smaller than the one below. Stairs led up the outside, allowing priests to climb to the temple at the very top. From there, they could speak to the god and perform sacred rituals. The ziggurat was surrounded by temples to other gods. Each deity had its own shrine where offerings could be made. Priests lived in quarters nearby, ready to serve the gods day and night. The whole complex was enclosed by 3 sets of massive walls, one inside the other. These walls were not just for defense. They marked off sacred space, separating the holy city from the ordinary world outside. Shutruk-Nahhunte poured enormous resources into this project. Thousands of workers labored for years to build the city. Bricks had to be made by the millions. Timber had to be brought from the mountains. Stone had to be quarried and transported. It was an achievement of organization and determination. Why did he do it? Religious devotion was part of the answer. Shutruk-Nahhunte genuinely believed he was honoring the gods. But there was also politics involved. Building such a magnificent holy city showed everyone that Elam was powerful again. It proved that the Dark Age was over. It was a statement of pride and strength that could be seen for miles around. The greatest warrior king in all of Elamite history was Shutruk-Nahhunte. He came to the throne around 1190 BCE at a time when the ancient world was in chaos. This was the late Bronze Age, a period of migrations and wars that toppled many old kingdoms. It was the perfect moment for an ambitious king to expand his power. Shutruk-Nahhunte looked west toward Mesopotamia and saw opportunity. Babylon, once mighty, was now weak and divided. The Kassite dynasty that had ruled for centuries was failing. Different cities were fighting each other for dominance. No one was strong enough to unite the region. It was like watching a lion growing old and weak, waiting for younger predators to attack. The Elamite king did not wait long. He gathered his armies and marched into Mesopotamia. His soldiers swept through city after city, defeating anyone who stood against them. The Babylonians were not ready for such a fierce assault. Their armies fell apart in battle. Their kings fled or were captured. In 1158 BCE, Shutruk-Nahhunte captured Babylon itself. This was the greatest city in Mesopotamia, home to the famous Hanging Gardens, center of learning and culture. Now it belonged to Elam. The Elamite soldiers poured through the streets, looting the temples and palaces. They took everything of value they could carry. But Shutruk-Nahhunte wanted more than just gold and silver. He wanted to take Babylon's very soul. He ordered his soldiers to remove the statues of the Babylonian gods from their temples. These were not just art objects. Ancient people believed that the gods actually lived in their statues. To remove them was to kidnap the gods themselves. The most important prize was the statue of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. This statue was the spiritual heart of the city. Without it, Babylon was not really Babylon anymore. Shutruk-Nahhunte had the statue loaded onto a cart and carried back to Susa. It was the ultimate humiliation for the defeated city. He also took the Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous objects from ancient Mesopotamia. This was a tall stone pillar covered with writing. It recorded the laws that King Hammurabi had established centuries earlier. The code was a symbol of justice and civilization. By taking it to Susa, Shutruk-Nahhunte was claiming that Elam was now the center of civilization, not Babylon. The Elamite king filled Susa with the treasures he had captured.
Statues of gods line the temples.
Precious stones adorned the palaces. Inscriptions boasted of his victories. Shutruk-Nahhunte wanted everyone to know what he had accomplished. He wanted his name to echo through the ages, but conquest was not his only achievement. Shutruk-Nahhunte also worked to strengthen Elam internally. He repaired irrigation canals so farmers could water their fields more easily. He improved roads so merchants could travel safely. He appointed loyal governors to rule the provinces. He built new fortifications to protect the borders. His sons helped him rule the empire. The eldest son, Kutir-Nahhunte, was given command of the army. He led military campaigns while his father governed from Susa. Another son, Shilhak-in-Shushinak, administered the civil government. It was a family enterprise, with everyone working together to maintain Elamite power. When Shutruk-Nahhunte died around 1155 BCE, his son Kutir-Nahhunte became king. The new ruler continued his father's aggressive policies. He led more raids into Mesopotamia, extracting tribute from the terrified cities. For a brief time, it seemed like Elam might create a permanent empire that included both the Iranian highlands and the Mesopotamian plains. But Kutir-Nahhunte's reign was short. He died after ruling for only a few years. His brother Shilhak-in-Shushinak then took the throne. This king ruled for much longer, perhaps 25 years. He was more interested in building than in war. He constructed temples throughout Elam, honoring the gods in every city. Shilhak-in-Shushinak left more inscriptions than any other Elamite king. We find his name at sites all across the former kingdom. He was proud of his family's achievements and wanted to make sure everyone remembered them. His inscriptions list the territories conquered by his father and brother. They describe the temples he built and the offerings he made to the gods. But even as Shilhak-in-Shushinak built his temples, storm clouds were gathering. The glory days of Elamite power were about to end. A new force was rising in Mesopotamia that would prove stronger than anything Elam could field. The age of Elamite dominance was running out. While Elam had been focused on conquering Babylon, another kingdom was growing strong in the north. Assyria, based around the city of Nineveh, was building the most powerful military machine the ancient world had yet seen. The Neo-Assyrian Empire would become the first true superpower, dominating the entire Middle East. The Assyrians were ruthless warriors. They developed new military technologies like iron weapons and cavalry units. Their armies were well organized and brutally effective. They practiced a policy of terror, destroying cities that resisted and deporting entire populations. When Assyrian soldiers appeared on the horizon, people felt genuine fear. For many years, Elam and Assyria avoided direct conflict. They were far enough apart that their interests did not overlap much. Both kingdoms were busy with their own wars and conquests. But as Assyria grew stronger and expanded southward, collision became inevitable. The conflict began because of Babylon. After being conquered by Elam, Babylon had struggled to recover. Different kings claimed the throne, often fighting each other. The city needed a protector, someone strong enough to restore order. Some Babylonians looked to Assyria for help. Others wanted Elam to return. The great city became a prize fought over by the two powers. The Elamite kings could not let Assyria control Babylon. If that happened, Assyria would be right on Elam's border. The balance of power would shift dangerously. So Elam repeatedly intervened in Babylonian politics, supporting kings who would be friendly to Elamite interests. This brought them into conflict with Assyria, which had its own plans for Babylon. The first major clash came during the reign of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I around 1100 BCE. He led his armies against both Babylon and Elam. The fighting was fierce, but neither side could win decisively. The war dragged on, exhausting both kingdoms. Eventually, they made peace, but everyone knew it was temporary. For the next few centuries, Elam and Assyria watched each other warily. They fought occasional wars, usually over Babylon, but neither could defeat the other completely. Elam was protected by its mountains and by the difficulty of supplying an army so far from Assyrian territory. Assyria was protected by its superior military organization and its determination. During this time, Elam entered a period historians call the Neo-Elamite period, which lasted from about 1100 to 539 BCE. The kingdom was no longer the dominant power it had been under Shutruk-Nahhunte. Instead, it was struggling to maintain its independence against stronger neighbors. But the Elamites fought on, refusing to surrender. In the 700s BCE, the conflict intensified dramatically. The Assyrian Empire was now at the height of its power. King Sargon II and his successors were determined to dominate the entire region. They could not tolerate an independent Elam on their southern border. The decision was made to crush the Elamite kingdom once and for all. The wars that followed were devastating. Assyrian armies invaded Elam repeatedly. They burned cities and destroyed fields. They carried off prisoners by the thousands. The Elamite kings fought back desperately, winning some battles but losing more. The kingdom was being ground down, slowly but surely. An Elamite king named Shutruk-Nahhunte II tried to strike back. Around 694 BCE, he invaded Babylonia, hoping to keep the Assyrians busy. He supported a Babylonian rebel who was fighting against Assyrian control. For a while, the strategy seemed to work. The rebels held Babylon, and the Assyrians were forced to pull back. But the Assyrian king Sennacherib was not a man who accepted defeat. He gathered a massive army and returned to Babylon with overwhelming force. The city fell after a brutal siege. Sennacherib then turned his full attention to Elam. His soldiers marched east, determined to punish the kingdom that had dared to challenge Assyria. The Elamite heartland suffered terribly during these invasions. Cities were sacked and burned. The countryside was devastated. The population fled into the mountains to escape the Assyrian terror. It seemed like the end might finally come for this ancient kingdom that had survived so many crises. Then in 653 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launched what he intended to be the final campaign. His armies swept through Elam like a destroying wind. They captured city after city. Susa itself was taken and thoroughly looted. The Assyrians carried off treasures that had been accumulating for centuries, including some of the spoils that Shutruk-Nahhunte had taken from Babylon 500 years earlier. Ashurbanipal boasted in his inscriptions about the destruction he caused. He claimed to have destroyed the temples and scattered the bones of the dead kings. He said he had salted the fields so nothing would grow. He wanted to make sure that Elam could never threaten Assyria again. For a time, it seemed he had succeeded. Elam virtually disappeared from the historical record after this disaster. The kingdom was shattered, its cities in ruins, its population scattered. The glory that had lasted for millennia seemed to be gone forever. But deep in the mountains, something survived. To understand the Elamites, we need to look beyond wars and kings. We need to see how ordinary people lived, what they believed, and what made their culture unique. Despite all the invasions and destruction, enough evidence survives to give us a picture of Elamite life. The Elamite language was one of their most distinctive features. It was not related to any other known language. Linguists classify it as a language isolate, meaning it had no siblings or cousins. When Elamite died out, it left no descendants. This makes it difficult for modern scholars to understand fully, even though we have many inscriptions to study. The Elamites borrowed their writing system from Mesopotamia. They used cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing pressed into clay tablets, but they adapted it to write their own unique language. An Elamite scribe had to learn hundreds of signs and how to combine them to represent Elamite words. It took years of training to become fully literate. Most people could not read or write. Literacy was limited to scribes, priests, and some members of the royal family. These educated people held important positions in society. They kept the records that allowed the kingdom to function. They wrote letters for the kings. They recorded business transactions and legal agreements. Without scribes, the government could not operate. Family life was structured differently than in neighboring cultures. We have already mentioned that royal siblings sometimes married each other, but even among common people, marriage customs were distinct. Women could own property in their own right. They could conduct business independently. Divorce was possible and did not completely destroy a woman's social standing. Children were valued, but life was hard for everyone in the ancient world. Many children died young from disease or accidents. Those who survived childhood often had to work from an early age. Boys learned their father's trade, whether that was farming, crafts, or business. Girls learned household skills from their mothers, including cooking, weaving, and childcare. Religion pervaded every aspect of life. The gods were not distant beings unconcerned with humanity. They were active participants in the world, constantly involved in human affairs. When things went well, it was because the gods were pleased. When disaster struck, it meant the gods were angry and needed to be appeased with offerings and rituals. Temples were the center of religious life. People came to make offerings, seeking the gods' favor. They brought grain, animals, precious objects, anything that might please the divine powers. Priests performed elaborate rituals, especially on festival days. These ceremonies included processions, sacrifices, music, and feasting. Music was important in Elamite culture. Musicians played at religious ceremonies, royal celebrations, and private gatherings. They used instruments like lyres, harps, drums, and flutes, songs passed down through generations, telling stories of gods and heroes. Professional musicians were respected members of society. Art and craftsmanship flourished when the kingdom was at peace. Elamite artists created beautiful objects from various materials. They worked with clay, making both practical pottery and decorative vessels. They carved stone, creating statues and reliefs. They worked metal, producing weapons, tools, and jewelry. The best craftsmen enjoyed royal patronage and created treasures for the palace. Elamite art had its own style, though it was influenced by Mesopotamian traditions. Elamite sculptures often showed people and gods with distinct facial features and dress. The style was somewhat more naturalistic than the highly stylized art of Sumer. Elamite artists paid attention to details of clothing and jewelry, showing the fashions of their time. Trade was essential to Elamite prosperity. Merchants formed the backbone of a trading network that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. They traveled in caravans, carrying goods across dangerous territory. They dealt with multiple languages and currencies. Successful merchants could become wealthy and influential. The goods that passed through Elamite hands were diverse. From the west came grain, dates, textiles, and manufactured items from Mesopotamian workshops. From the east came metals, especially the copper and tin needed to make bronze. Precious stones like lapis lazuli and carnelian moved along the trade routes. Even luxury items like ivory and exotic woods sometimes appeared in Elamite markets. Agriculture supported everything else. Most Elamites were farmers who worked the land. They grew barley and wheat, the staple grains. They planted date palms, which provided both fruit and a kind of wine. They raised livestock, including sheep, goats, and cattle. In the mountains, shepherds moved their flocks to higher pastures in summer and back down in winter. Water management was crucial in this environment. Elam had better rainfall than Mesopotamia, but farmers still needed to irrigate their fields. They built canals to bring water from rivers to agricultural land. They constructed dams to store water. The maintenance of these systems required organization and cooperation among villages. A broken canal could mean crop failure and starvation. Cities were centers of power and culture. Susa was the greatest, but there were others. These urban centers had defensive walls, often massive structures of mud brick. Inside the walls stood palaces where the kings lived and ruled. Temples rose on platforms dominating the skyline. Markets buzzed with activity as people bought and sold goods. Residential neighborhoods spread out in a maze of narrow streets. Houses were built of mud brick, the same material used for temples and palaces. The wealthy lived in larger homes with multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard. This courtyard was open to the sky, providing light and air. Poorer families lived in smaller, simpler structures. Everyone dealt with the same challenges of heat in summer and cold in winter. Daily life followed patterns shaped by the seasons and the demands of agriculture. During planting and harvest times, everyone worked long hours. Between these busy periods came times of relative leisure when people could attend festivals, visit family, or simply rest. Life was hard, but it had its rhythms and its pleasures. The Elamites enjoyed games and entertainment. Archaeological evidence shows they played board games, though we are not always sure of the exact rules. Children played with toys, including small clay animals and dolls. Adults told stories around evening fires, passing down the history and legends of their people. Food was simple, but adequate when times were good. Bread made from barley or wheat was the staple. People ate dates, vegetables, and beans. Meat was less common, usually reserved for special occasions or wealthier families. Beer was a common drink made from fermented barley. Wine was more expensive and less widely available. Clothing varied by social class. Common people wore simple garments, tunics or robes made from wool or linen. The wealthy dressed more elaborately with finer fabrics and decorative elements. Kings and queens wore special garments that marked their status. Jewelry was popular among those who could afford it, with necklaces, bracelets, and earrings made from precious metals and stones. Medicine was a mixture of practical knowledge and religious ritual. Healers understood some diseases and injuries from experience. They knew how to set broken bones, treat wounds, and prepare herbal remedies. But they also believed that many illnesses had supernatural causes. Treatment therefore included prayers, offerings to the gods, and rituals to drive out evil spirits. Law and justice were important to maintain social order. Kings issued laws and appointed judges to settle disputes. Contracts were written and sealed, creating legally binding agreements. Crimes were punished according to established codes. The goal was to maintain harmony and prevent feuds that could tear communities apart. Death was not the end in Elamite belief. They thought the dead continued to exist in some form in the underworld. Proper burial was therefore essential. Bodies were interred with grave goods, objects the deceased might need in the afterlife. The wealthy were buried with elaborate offerings. Even poor families tried to provide something for their dead. Royal burials were especially elaborate. Kings and queens were laid to rest with treasures, furniture, and sometimes even servants who were sacrificed to accompany them. These tombs have provided archaeologists with valuable information about Elamite culture. The objects buried with the dead tell us about their beliefs, their values, and their artistic achievements. After the Assyrian devastation of the 600s BCE, Elam seemed to vanish from history. The old kingdom was gone, its cities ruined, its power broken. But the Elamite people themselves did not disappear. They survived in the mountains and valleys, living in smaller communities, maintaining their culture and identity even without a kingdom. Something remarkable happened in the following century. A new power arose in the Iranian highlands, a people called the Persians. They were related to the Medes, another Iranian group, but they had their own identity and ambitions. The Persians built their capital at Anshan, one of the old Elamite cities. They lived among the descendants of the Elamites and learned from them. The Persian kings who built the Achaemenid Empire owed a great debt to Elam. They borrowed Elamite administrative systems. They employed Elamite scribes to keep their records. For centuries, Elamite was one of the official languages of the Persian Empire, used alongside Old Persian and Akkadian. The great inscriptions at Persepolis, the Persian capital, include Elamite versions. In fact, many tablets found at Persepolis are written entirely in Elamite. These are administrative documents, records of payments and supplies. They show that Elamite remained a living language for government purposes. Well into the 400s BCE, the Persian Empire could not have functioned as it did without this Elamite inheritance. The region that had been Elam became a Persian province called Elamite. The people there remembered their heritage. Greek historians who visited the area in later centuries noted that the inhabitants claimed to be descended from the ancient Elamites. They preserved some of the old traditions and worshipped gods whose names echoed the ancient deities. But gradually, over centuries, the Elamite identity faded. New peoples moved into the region. New languages replaced Elamite. The Persian language, which belongs to the Indo-European family, became dominant. By the time of the Islamic conquests in the 600s CE, nothing remained of the Elamite language except inscriptions on ancient monuments that no one could read. And so the Elamites were forgotten. Medieval scholars in the Islamic world knew about ancient Persia.
They knew about Babylon and Assyria.
But Elam was just a name in old texts, a mystery without a story. Europeans who studied ancient history in later centuries focused on the civilizations mentioned in the Bible and Greek sources. Elam was barely a footnote. The rediscovery of Elam began in the 1800s when archaeologists started excavating. In the Middle East, French archaeologists arrived at the mound of Susa in 1884. What they found amazed them. The site was huge, with layers of occupation going back thousands of years. They uncovered palaces, temples, and thousands of artifacts. Among the most important finds was the Code of Hammurabi, the law code that Shutruk-Nahhunte had carried off from Babylon. It had been sitting in Susa for over 3,000 years, waiting to be found. The discovery made headlines around the world. The code is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, one of its most treasured possessions. The excavations at Susa continued for decades. Archaeologists found the remains of the great Ziggurat and other temples. They uncovered royal tombs with their treasures. They found thousands of clay tablets covered with cuneiform writing. These tablets were the key to understanding Elamite civilization. Deciphering Elamite was extremely difficult. Unlike Akkadian or Old Persian, Elamite was not related to any known language. Scholars had to work through the trilingual inscriptions where the same text appeared in 3 languages. By comparing the Elamite version with the other languages, they slowly figured out what the words meant. The work took generations. Even today, our understanding of Elamite is incomplete. There are words whose meanings remain uncertain, grammar rules that are not fully understood. but we know enough now to read Elamite inscriptions and to understand the basic outline of their history. Other important sites have been excavated since Susa. Chogar Zanbil, the holy city built by Untash-Napirisha, was discovered in 1935. It is remarkably well preserved, with its ziggurat still standing to a height of over 80 feet. The site was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. Visitors can walk through the ancient streets and see the temple where priests once worshipped. Modern Iran takes pride in its Elamite heritage. The sites are protected and studied by Iranian archaeologists. Museums in Tehran display Elamite artifacts. School children learn about the Elamites as part of their national history. After being forgotten for so long, the Elamites are being remembered again. What is the legacy of Elam? It was never as famous as Egypt or Babylon. It did not leave behind pyramids or hanging gardens. Its writing system died out completely. And yet, Elam matters. For over 2,000 years, it was a major power in the ancient world. It fought wars, built cities, created art, and developed a unique culture. The Elamites showed that civilization could take different forms. They did not simply copy their Mesopotamian neighbors. They developed their own political system, their own approach to gender and family, their own artistic style. They proved that there were multiple ways to build a successful society in the ancient world. Their greatest legacy may be their contribution to Persian civilization. The Achaemenid Empire, which united the ancient world from Egypt to India, was built on Elamite foundations. When Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great ruled their vast domains, they used administrative techniques and practices that came from Elam. In this way, Elamite influence spread far beyond their original homeland. The story of Elam is also a reminder of how much history has been lost. This was a civilization that lasted longer than the United States has existed, longer than the Roman Empire endured. Millions of people lived and died as Elamites. They loved and fought, built and destroyed, hoped and despaired. Most of their stories are gone forever, lost when their cities fell and their language died. But what we can recover matters. Every inscription translated, every artifact studied, every site excavated brings us closer to these vanished people. We cannot bring them back, but we can remember them. We can tell their story. We can recognize that they too were part of the human family,
living lives that mattered in their own time. Today, if you visit southwestern Iran,
you can still see traces of Elam. The ruins of Susa lie near the modern city of Shush. Chogar Zanbil rises from the plain, its ancient bricks still defying time. These monuments speak across the centuries, reminding us that great civilizations have risen and fallen before, and will rise and fall again. The Elamites understood impermanence. They saw kingdoms conquered and rebuilt. They watched empires rise to glory and collapse into dust. They knew that nothing human lasts forever, and yet they built anyway. They created beauty and order in their corner of the world. They raised families and told stories and worshipped their gods. They lived fully in their time, knowing or not knowing that they would be forgotten. Now we remember them again. Persia's first forgotten kings, the people who lived in the land of the god. The Elamites, who once ruled an empire and then vanished into the mists of time, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists with shovels and scholars with patience. Their story is part of our shared human past, a chapter in the long book of civilization. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those ancient people living in their cities by the mountains. Think about farmers working their fields, merchants traveling dusty roads, priests climbing the ziggurat steps, kings making decisions that affected thousands of lives. They are gone now, but for a moment we have brought them back. We have remembered the forgotten. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this exploration of Elamite history, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the Historian's Tome for more stories from the ancient world. Sleep well, wherever you are, whatever time it is. May your dreams be filled with ancient wonders and forgotten kingdoms.
Until next time, good night.